The Princess of Wales pledged herself to serve her country and her people, and to maintain the precious principles of constitutional government which lie at the heart of our nation.
The atmosphere inside the briefing room at Buckingham Palace did not explode into chaos when the senior legal advisors finally finished reading the document. Instead, it was the terrifying, suffocating silence that made the moment truly unforgettable. There were no loud outcries, no immediate legal denials, and no desperate interruptions from anyone seated around the large polished table. There was only a heavy, almost physical stillness that seemed to press against the ancient walls of the palace, trapping everyone in a state of absolute disbelief. King Charles slowly lowered his eyes, his gaze freezing on the final page of the document, unable to look at anyone else. Beside him, Catherine sat perfectly still, her posture immaculate, as the sheer weight of what had just been revealed began to settle in the room. Everyone present suddenly realized that Prince Philip's final will and testament had fundamentally altered the future of royal power forever. King Charles knew that every single person sitting at that table had heard the exact same sentence, yet the monarch seemed utterly unable to accept its legal reality. The lawyers confirmed the terms plainly and without emotion. Prince Philip's final, legally binding will granted Catherine's sole regency authority if a major constitutional crisis or an unforeseen family emergency ever threatened the stability of the British crown. A final will is designed to record a person's absolute wishes after death, but in this context, regency authority meant something far grander. It represented the legal power to act on behalf of the monarchy when the reigning sovereign could no longer carry the heavy burden of the throne. This was not a private compliment, a warm gesture, or a sentimental blessing from grandfather. This was Prince Philip deliberately placing absolute legal trust in Catherine, elevating her above every single competing voice and traditional hierarchy inside the palace walls. Catherine did not move at first. She kept her hands close to the table, but her fingers tightened visibly against the polished wooden edge as the gravity of the words echoed in her mind. Prince William noticed her reaction immediately. The prince did not interrupt the proceedings, yet his eyes remained fixed on his wife with a quiet, undeniable fear that he could not entirely hide from those watching. Catherine had entered that closed briefing expecting nothing more than standard formality, perhaps a bit of routine family tension, but certainly not this massive historical shift. She had not been granted a piece of historic jewelry, a hollow title, or a mere ceremonial honor. Instead, she had been handed the ultimate responsibility for maintaining royal order at a time when everyone else in the family might be deeply divided. Queen Camilla heard one specific word more sharply and painfully than all the others in that clause, and that word was soul. The queen consort's expression shifted before she could stop her features from betraying her thoughts. That single word closed every door of shared influence. It meant there would be no shared counsel, no private household balance of power, and no counterweight strong enough to challenge Catherine's ultimate authority in a crisis. Princess Anne watched the room unfold with a sharp eye, appearing far less surprised than the rest of the family. She had known Philip during his long life as a man who valued decisive action over comfort, and now his final judgment sat directly before them, signed, sealed, and entirely impossible to soften or ignore. King Charles read the specific clause one more time to be absolutely sure. Then, he set the page down with a slow, deliberate motion that only made the surrounding silence feel deeper and more menacing. The king was not merely facing a complicated legal instruction from a team of lawyers. He was facing his father's final, unyielding opinion on who possessed the strength to steady the monarchy when blood, marriage, rank, and personal loyalty pulled against one another. Prince William looked directly from Charles to Catherine, and the sudden glance shared between husband and wife carried something deeply painful, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that was about to break. But before Catherine could truly understand the immense power placed in her hands, the palace had to confront the people who felt most wounded by Prince Philip's final decision. Every historical royal crisis possesses a defining document, But this particular one had distinct faces. There was Charles, stunned by his father's final, unexpected move from beyond the grave. There was William, instantly becoming protective of the wife who had suddenly been pulled into the center of British history. There was Catherine herself, fighting a silent battle not to tremble under the sudden gaze of the room. There was Camilla, realizing the absolute legal limits of her own influence, and watching the entire room with the hard, analytical calm of someone who had suspected this exact truth long before anyone else dared to speak it aloud. King Charles stood at the very center of this emotional storm, not because Prince Philip's will openly attacked his reign, but because it wounded his pride in a much quieter, deeper way. The king could survive public criticism, he could withstand political pressure, and he had lived his entire life beneath the immense weight of royal expectation. But this was entirely different. This was Philip, his own father, reaching out from the grave to suggest that one day, the reign might desperately need a stabilizing hand completely outside the throne itself. That implicit doubt cut through Charles more sharply than any public insult ever could, because it touched upon the one fear no reigning monarch ever once spoken aloud, that bloodline and inherited authority may not always be enough to protect the crown from fracturing. Catherine felt the entire room turning its attention toward her, and that sudden focus carried absolutely no sense of personal triumph. It carried only pure weight. She had never fought for this specific power, she had never whispered in corridors for it, and she had never built a private campaign around her own advancement. Philip's final words had placed her at the heart of something far larger than personal status or court popularity. She had legally become the emotional and constitutional focal point of the monarchy, because someone who understood duty better than almost anyone else in modern history had decided that she was the only one who could hold steady when others might break under pressure. Catherine tried her best to keep her face entirely calm, but William saw the immense strain she was hiding beneath the table. He reached out toward her hand, not as a future king asserting his control over a situation, but simply as a husband quietly trying to steady the woman who had suddenly been handed a historical burden larger than any physical crown. Camilla sat back in her chair, and her sudden silence became its own kind of bitter confession. The queen consort did not need to utter a single word for her emotional wound to show to everyone in the room. The will had not officially named her as an enemy, but had drawn a sharp, unyielding boundary around her influence with brutal legal clarity. It told everyone in that room precisely where Catherine's authority began and exactly where Camilla's influence ended forever. That total exclusion hurt more because it was formal, final, and spoken directly in front of every person who mattered in the family hierarchy. Anger might have given her the strength to argue, but the heavy silence only revealed how deeply the document had landed in her heart. Princess and broke that silence with a question sharp enough to make even the senior lawyers pause in their tracks. She asked whether Prince Philip's sealed memorandum had ever been legally challenged or questioned by the palace advisors prior to this day. A memorandum, in simple terms, is a written instruction meant to preserve an important decision clearly and permanently across time. The answer from the legal team came back firm and immediate. No advisor had ever touched it. One legal official then admitted that the document had remained completely untouched because reopening it during Philip's final years could have exposed decades of private fear over who could truly protect the crown in a catastrophic moment of national instability. King Charles rose slowly from the table and walked away into the shadows of the room alone, and everyone present understood the truth. The will had not only elevated Catherine, it had permanently reopened Prince Philip's unfinished judgment of his own family, a judgment that did not appear from nowhere, but was born from a private incident that changed Philip's view of the monarchy forever. The shadows of that unforgettable evening stretched deeper into the corridors of Windsor Castle, carrying with them a cold reality that no one in the royal family could easily escape or deny. Long before the legal team had gathered to unseal the final documents, and long before Catherine had ever heard her name spoken with such absolute, terrifying constitutional authority, there was one pivotal night that changed Prince Philip's perspective forever. It was not an event covered by the international press. It was not a public scandal that made global headlines, and it was not a grand ceremony filled with forced smiles. It was a fiercely private, tense family meeting that occurred right after a solemn royal memorial dinner, where a single careless statement from a court insider convinced the aging prince that the British crown desperately required an objective protector outside the immediate line of succession. Philip had witnessed decades of intense royal friction and internal household rivalries during his lifetime, but that specific night felt fundamentally different from all the rest. The Windsor memorial dinner dispute, as it would quietly become known among the inner circle of the palace, had begun after a heavy, emotional gathering meant to honor the lifelong duty, quiet memory, and immense personal sacrifice of those who had served the crown before them. A memorial dinner within the royal family is traditionally a highly private occasion, designed to remember someone deeply important to their shared history. But this particular evening did not conclude with family peace or mutual comfort. Instead, it ended with voices tightening in the dim light, hidden loyalties beginning to fracture under pressure, and the old, dangerous question rising to the surface once more: who should truly guide and protect the monarchy if Charles ever became completely overwhelmed by public scrutiny and private family divisions? From the very beginning of that private debate, Charles felt backed into a defensive corner. The prince was not yet sitting beneath the full, crushing weight of the crown in that moment, but he understood perfectly well that the sharp trajectory of the conversation pointed directly toward his own competency and future reign. Every suggestion made by the senior courtiers sounded like a masked doubt, and every carefully calculated phrase felt like a subtle warning about his emotional stability. Prince William heard the underlying tension in the room as well, and the young prince instantly grew fiercely protective, not only of his father's vulnerable position at the table, but also of Catherine, who had been quietly pulled into a volatile conversation she had absolutely no part in creating. She sat there listening intently, while the more ambitious voices in the room spoke over one another, her face remaining entirely steady, her chosen words remarkably measured, and her deep patience carrying an almost painful intensity that everyone noticed. Queen Camilla felt increasingly dismissed as the strategic arguments grew sharper and more personal around them. The queen consort held a firm, unyielding belief that absolute loyalty within the king's immediate household should be the only metric that mattered, and she carried that belief with a sense of wounded pride that was visible to everyone. Catherine did not challenge her stance with anger or loud words. Instead, she simply asked a single, devastating question that pierced through the noise: what would happen to the nation if loyalty to one specific person came into direct legal conflict with loyalty to the institution of the crown itself? That question landed much harder than a direct accusation, and Prince Philip noticed it immediately from his seat. He watched Catherine bring an immediate sense of order and logical restraint to a room that had actively begun to split into factions, achieving this not by a show of raw force or high social status, but through pure, unwavering dignity. Then came the single sentence from a senior palace advisor that changed the course of royal history. The courtier survivalist boldly suggested that crisis influence should always remain exclusively within the ruling king's immediate household, as if mere physical proximity to Charles should decide who held ultimate power during a national emergency. Prince Philip's reaction to that statement was immediate, sharp, and entirely unforgettable for everyone present. He asked the room whether loyalty to a passing household was truly the same thing as loyalty to the permanent crown, and a heavy, suffocating silence followed his words. No one answered him quickly because no one could find a safe answer. An emergency regency memorandum, which is a written legal instruction detailing who may act during a catastrophic royal emergency, suddenly transformed from mere technical language in Philip's mind into a vital shield for the monarchy's survival. After that tense meeting concluded, Philip made his definitive choice in absolute privacy. He directly instructed the royal lawyers to add Catherine's name to the highly classified, sealed instruction because he had witnessed something far stronger than raw ambition in her dignified silence. Years later, when the senior lawyers read that exact memorandum aloud to the stunned family. Every person in that room was instantly forced back to the memory of that fateful night at Windsor, especially Camilla, who remembered precisely what had been said and exactly how her own influence had been outmaneuvered. Once the vivid memory of that night returned to the family, an easy silence was no longer possible for anyone. Someone had to actively confront the legal reality that Prince Philip had left behind, and the very first confrontation did not happen in front of the media cameras. It occurred behind a tightly closed palace door immediately after the lawyers had departed, leaving the family alone with the structural wreckage of the announcement. Charles stood rigidly near the stone fireplace. Catherine remained near the center table, with William standing protectively by her side, while Camilla stood near the exit door, as if she were already deciding whether to stay and fight the decision or simply walk away from the deep humiliation. Charles desperately wanted to reassert total control over his family, but the room no longer belonged to his authority in the way it once had. The king had specifically requested this private family discussion because he knew that the volatile legal briefing could not remain contained within palace walls for long. A briefing is a formal meeting where specialized advisors explain complex decisions and historical documents. But this particular briefing had done far more than explain old text. It had exposed deep family vulnerabilities and placed Prince Philip's final, unvarnished judgment directly in front of the very people most affected by its contents. Charles knew he needed at least one raw, honest conversation without the presence of royal aides, without the careful, protective palace language, and without anyone trying to soften the hard truth before it reached the wider corridors of the estate. Camilla broke the fragile surface tension first. The queen consort did not raise her voice, and that chilling restraint made her question feel infinitely more dangerous to everyone listening. She looked directly at the lawyer's notes and asked whether Catherine now officially outranked the queen in matters of absolute emergency authority. The bitter words hung heavily in the air, carrying a resentment that no one in the room could fully disguise or ignore. Catherine answered her with extreme care and humility. She stated clearly that she had never sought this specific role, had never asked for Prince Philip's exclusive trust, and had absolutely no desire to gain constitutional power at the cost of another woman's personal dignity. But Camilla interpreted that calm humility as hidden confidence, and she viewed Catherine's restraint as a quiet victory dance. Her face tightened with visible anger because the will had not only placed Catherine above her during a national crisis, it had forced every single person in the room to witness her displacement. William felt the seismic shift in power before anyone dared to name aloud. The prince stood immovably beside Catherine, but his heavy silence carried its own kind of raw confession. King Charles turned his gaze toward his son and asked him directly whether he had known about his grandfather's secret plan all along. It was a father's emotional question, but it landed in the room like a formal accusation of betrayal. William paused for only a brief second before responding. Yet that tiny moment of hesitation wounded the king more deeply than any verbal answer ever could. It strongly suggested that Prince Philip's legal trust had been moving through the family in quiet, alternative channels for years, completely around Charles, entirely beyond Camilla, and straight toward Catherine, long before the legal team ever opened the historic file. Princess Anne finally spoke up in the corner, and the dynamic of the room shifted once again. The Princess Royal revealed through a highly private conversation she had recorded in her own personal diaries that Philip had explicitly warned her years earlier that the British crown would one day desperately need the one person who was least hungry for its power. That single sentence made Catherine's sudden appointment feel less like a modern legal strategy and more like a profound, final act of absolute faith. A crown is never merely a beautiful symbol of sovereign rule. It is the ultimate moral burden of holding a fractured nation's confidence when intense family emotions threaten to derail public duty. Camilla placed her trembling hand firmly on the brass door handle, stating bitterly that Catherine had been granted massive constitutional authority without ever living through the decades of personal sacrifices that came before it. Catherine did not strike back with anger. She simply looked at her and answered that if that were true, then she must spend the rest of her life proving she is worthy of it. That quiet, resolute answer effectively shifted the entire balance of power in the room. But Catherine's calm resolve only introduced the next, most dangerous question of all: who now truly controlled the internal machinery of royal authority? The early morning light slowly crept through the high windows of Kensington Palace. Yet the physical dawn brought absolutely no comfort or resolution to the emotional chaos that had completely consumed the British monarchy overnight. Power within a traditional institution like the royal family rarely announces its arrival with a golden crown or a grand public processional. Sometimes it manifests as a locked iron drawer, a fresh signature line on a document, or a heavy leather chair placed strategically at the head of a smaller briefing table. By the next morning, Catherine understood with terrifying clarity that Prince Philip's final will and testament had not been designed to offer her an empty decoration, a polite family sentiment, or a comfortable courtly title. It had handed her absolute constitutional access, undeniable legal authority, and the deeply frightening right to act decisively when every other member of the royal household hesitated in a moment of catastrophic national instability. Catherine was forced to face the immense, practical reality of that authority long before the rest of the palace even had time to breathe or process the shocking news. Senior government officials and royal attorneys immediately began interpreting the specific clauses of Prince Philip's will, not as a piece of interesting family history or an old man's personal wish, but as an active, working state power that required immediate implementation. Emergency Regency preparations now mandated Catherine's direct, individual consultation on all matters of state stability. Crisis protocols could no longer be finalized without her formal written approval, and highly sensitive succession safeguards were adjusted overnight. These hidden, protected plans that exist to defend the crown if sudden illness, massive public scandal, or total family breakdown ever threatened the continuity of the monarchy could no longer move exclusively through the old, traditional channels controlled by the reigning king. Inside the heavily guarded walls of the palace, the word protocol suddenly carried a deep, underlying sense of institutional panic because it meant the state was actively preparing for dark scenarios that no one in the family wanted to openly name. Catherine sat quietly at her personal desk with a senior legal secretary as the very first official binder marked exclusively for her Regency approval was set before her. She did not reach out her hand to touch the documents immediately. The sheer weight of Prince Philip's immense legal trust pressed down on her soul harder than ever before because it had transformed from a reading of words into a practical system of national survival. This was no longer just a shocking sentence read aloud in a tense, silent briefing room. It was a complex network of administrative access and a distinct line of command that placed her entirely outside the reach of normal household rivalries and personal vendettas. Her newfound authority did not derive from King Charles. It did not depend on Prince William, and it certainly could not be stripped away by Queen Camilla. It flowed directly from Prince Philip's legally protected, unalterable final instruction, making it completely impossible for anyone to challenge without appearing to launch a direct attack on the memory of the Duke of Edinburgh himself. William watched the entire scene from the doorway of the office, his expression a complicated mix of profound pride and deep, heavy unease. The future king knew better than anyone else that Catherine possessed the unique moral stamina required to steady a fracturing monarchy. But he also understood precisely what that steadiness would cost her personal peace over the coming years. Every single official signature she placed on a Regency document would invite bitter resentment from within the family, and every state consultation would serve as a painful reminder to the household that Philip had chosen her over everyone else. William desperately wanted to shield his wife from the toxic bitterness gathering in the palace corridors. Yet he understood a cruel constitutional truth: protecting Catherine too openly or interfering with her duties might make her independent authority look like his personal influence. So he forced himself to remain silent as pride and fear waged a silent war inside his heart. Then came the specific legal detail that shattered any remaining hope of a family compromise. A senior advisor explained that no royal spouse, court official, or political figure possessed the constitutional power to override Catherine's emergency authority once the conditions detailed in the will were activated. A regency, in plain terms, is a temporary governing system where a designated individual acts to keep state power stable when a monarch cannot fully carry out their duties. But Philip had engineered this specific version with surgical legal precision, making Catherine the ultimate gatekeeper of the crown's survival. The second sealed instruction made that truth impossible for anyone to soften or ignore, as Philip had explicitly mandated that all emergency communications must be routed through Catherine's office before reaching external political advisors. Catherine looked down at the official acknowledgement page for several long seconds, her pen hovering over the paper as her hand paused, fully aware that signing the page meant accepting all the brutal personal consequences that would follow. Those consequences arrived far faster than anyone inside the palace expected, as the entire royal estate began to visibly fracture and divide around Catherine's historic new position. There is absolutely no public announcement made to the press during those initial hours, but inside the palace walls, every single staff member, courtier, and guard knew that the dynamic of the monarchy had shifted forever. Heavy wooden doors closed much sooner than usual. Private conversations stopped abruptly the exact moment Catherine entered a room, and Camilla's aides moved carefully through corridors that suddenly felt distinctly hostile. King Charles withdrew completely into his private study to hold hushed meetings. William became intensely watchful of every court movement, and Catherine, who had spent over a decade avoiding the dramatic center of palace political storms, found herself standing completely alone right in the middle of one. By midday, various royal departments were quietly but rapidly adjusting their standard operating procedures, ensuring that Catherine was automatically copied on all top-secret security briefings that had once moved exclusively through the king's inner circle. An emergency briefing is a highly confidential update prepared when the monarchy faces sudden danger, and being included in that specific chain of command meant she was now officially treated as a core pillar of national security. That structural change mattered immensely because Philip's will had not simply sought to honor Catherine's character. It had actively inserted her into the very machinery that protects the British crown when external pressure becomes dangerous. Queen Camilla learned of these sweeping operational changes in the coldest, most humiliating way possible, through a sudden, noticeable absence of information. A critical security update that would have traditionally reached her personal household staff first had been silently rerouted directly to Catherine's desk, and not a single palace official had warned her before the change took effect. The queen consort sat entirely alone in her private sitting room, slowly removing her reading glasses as the full, bitter meaning of the document settled into her mind. She had survived decades of intense public judgment, survived years of deep media suspicion, and walked a long, agonizing road to royal acceptance. But this specific emotional wound was entirely different because it came from the very heart of the family she had fought to join. It arrived with Prince Philip's unyielding name attached to it, and because of that undeniable legality, her rising anger had absolutely no safe or constructive place to go without endangering the monarchy itself. King Charles carried the internal conflict like a crushing physical weight that he could not set down for a single moment, feeling torn between his deep desire to defend his wife's honor and his constitutional duty to respect his father's final wishes. During a brief, tense exchange in the hallway with Princess, the king appeared visibly aged and exhausted, not because he lacked kingly authority, but because exercising that authority had become emotionally impossible under the circumstances, and did not offer him soft words of comfort or hollow reassurances. The Princess Royal firmly reminded her brother that their father had always separated personal affection from permanent royal duty, and that brutal distinction now stood immovably between Charles and the family peace he so desperately craved. William discovered the hardest truth of all from a senior archivist who found older emergency files containing Catherine's name written in Philip's distinct handwriting in the margins. proving that this grand design had been forming in his mind long before the final will was officially signed. That evening, away from the prying eyes of advisors, William and Catherine sat together in a dimly lit private room where the monarchy suddenly felt completely human. And for the very first time, Catherine allowed herself to express the deep fear she had hidden from the world, the terrifying fear of becoming the permanent symbol of a royal family divided against itself. She understood that Philip had chosen her because she could hold absolute power within her hands without ever needing to display it or weaponize it against others. And as the narrative finally reached its conclusion, she accepted that duty had chosen her to be the quiet safeguard the crown would desperately need.